Hey, yo, sister students, it's Mr. Baker again. This is Baker's Corner. I hope you're doing really well. We are going to actually explore the Cold War today for a few moments. And if you kind of look at my screen, guys, just really quick, you'll notice that I have the Cold War going from 1945 until 1963. And a lot of you guys, if you know anything about the Cold War, if you've talked to your parents, if you've talked to maybe your grandparents or other people that had lived during that time, they're going to tell you that this is not the end of the Cold War. It's basically about the first, about the first 18 years. The Cold War does not come to an end until, in some people's vision, the fall of the Soviet Union, which was December of 1991. So why are we leaving it in 1963? And the answer is, guys, this is such an expansive time period or element or aspect of a time period that we want to really kind of break it down. And so what we want to ask ourselves, guys, what is the big picture of the Cold War? And first of all, it doesn't just happen right away, all right? But there are going to be considerable tensions between the United States and, of course, the Soviet Union. So a lot of you are like, well, man, why is that? Well, a lot of it has to do with, you guessed it, World War II, all right? So what I like to ask my students, guys, just like the question about World War II, what do we already know about World War II? Just to get a little bit of a perspective on what you all already associate with it, is what comes to mind when you think about the Cold War. And feel free to pause the screen for a moment or the video, because when I think of the Cold War, I think of things like tensions, like was on the previous slide. I think of rivalry developing. I think of varying sets of ideologies and interests, democracy versus dictatorship, capitalism versus communism, those kinds of things. All right. And I also think of things like an ambition to outdo another side. Now, guys, this ambition could be anything from, influencing territories around the world or countries. And it could also be something along the lines of a space race or armed race. And even the idea, guys, of competition in sports. For those of you that are familiar down the line with the famous Miracle on Ice of 1980, where the American hockey team defeated the Soviet Union and basically, nobody gave them a chance to do that. Guys, everything was about that competition word. All right. And so what do we want to think? Guys, when we think about the Cold War, feel free to stop the screen, guys. These two key terms, I would argue, if there's ever two key terms in today's lesson that are definite vocabulary terms that we want to be able to apply successfully, we want to be able to apply the term containment and also collective security. All right. Now, collective security is not a new concept, so we'll kind of go in a little bit of a different order. But guys, if you think back to like the development of the League of Nations and other kinds of organizations, what are you really trying to do? You're trying to develop alliances to basically strengthen the security. Now, in the case of the UN, this is going to be the world, right? So we're not just talking about countries that are going to be democratic. We're going to have the Soviet Union that's a member. We're going to have other countries that are members as well that we don't always see eye to eye with. All right. Because the idea of collective security is cooperation of several countries, or it could be even over 100, like the UN, in an alliance to strengthen the security of each. All right. So this could be anything, guys, security-wise, from military support to political support to even economic support, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So if you're kind of wondering what really plays into the collective security, and we'll look at this more in a second, it's going to be the development of things like the United Nations that's going to replace the UN. Now, guys, a lot of you are like, well, or the League of Nations, excuse me. All right. So a lot of you are like, okay, well, Mr. Baker, we talked about in previous lessons how the League doesn't really have a lot of power. It doesn't have a lot of opportunity to really kind of put the world on notice. And a lot of us guys should already know the U.S. never joined it. Well, we are going to be a very active member of the United Nations. So I think we learned a lot about that. And also, guys, keep in mind, post-World War II, the United States, as we'll see more in a second, guys, is not going to be able to go into the same period of isolation, right? Because we're going to be a more active country. We make that great leap forward, if you will, into a superpower, which I think changes the dynamic, guys, of the country as far as the world stage is concerned, et cetera. Okay. Now, what about the importance, guys, of containment? Well, think about it like this. What's the big thing that the United States and other countries that are more democratic do not want to see? They do not want to see the expansion of communism. All right. So this is going to be a formal policy that is going to define administrations from the time period of Harry S. Truman post World War II, all right, to, of course, even the fall of the Soviet Union up in the early 90s with George H.W. Bush. All right. So if you think about it, guys, there is a long range of presidents that are going to have to figure out, from Truman to Eisenhower, et cetera, they're going to have to figure out, how do we actually go about trying to make it to where we limit communist influence? And guys, if you think about what it means to contain, all right, that means to basically not allow it to expand further with where it already exists. All right. So it's a policy. All right. So if you think about it, guys, this is going to become a major, major driving force of the United States post World War II. Okay. And so the question is, why do we have the development of what we call this Cold War? Well, first of all, like I said a moment ago, guys, it doesn't happen right away, right? Or overnight. Okay. So during the World War II time period, you've got a lot of division between even countries that were on the Allied side. So countries like Britain and the United States are going to be disagreeing quite extensively, with countries like the Soviet Union. Now, a little bit of background, guys, further. So what's going to happen? Well, if you think about it, guys, the big issue as far as the Soviet Union, one of them is going to be they do not want to see another Germany to actually do what Germany has done during World War II, right? So they're going to basically have this position that they want to have kind of like a buffer protection zone from basically Germany. And that buffer zone is essentially going to be countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia. We call those the Eastern or Soviet bloc nations. Some people would call them, guys, in Eastern Europe. All right, we'll look at that more in a second. And so, guys, what happens is that the issue of democratic or freer elections in Poland becomes a big deal moving into the end of World War II and also beyond. Now, at first, Stalin doesn't like this idea, of course, but then he's like, okay, well, I won't push the envelope a ton. But you got to remember, guys, at the end of World War II, August of 1945, Stalin is the only remaining of the big three leaders. Roosevelt has since died, keep in mind, from the earlier conferences in the early part of 1945. Winston Churchill steps down as an important leader of Great Britain, was the prime minister position. All right. So he's going to hold a lot more power, control, influence, if you will. All right. But one thing that they did agree on that's going to also create further problems is going to be, as you can see here, guys, the division of Germany. What do you all notice about Germany? It's going to be broken into 4 parts. All right. Some people refer to these as zones of occupation, right? So you're going to have the British zone, the French zone, the American zone, and also, of course, the Soviet zone. Now, I want you all guys to take a look really quick at the map here with the location of Berlin. Berlin, guys, if you look at it, what zone is it located in? It's going to be located entirely in the Soviet zone. All right. So a lot of you are like, well, Mr. Baker, Berlin becomes a pretty important city. I know that it became divided. There was a Berlin Wall down the line. All right. So, guys, the problem with this is that they're eventually going to divide Berlin, as we'll see on a future slide in a moment, guys, in a very similar way as they're going to with Germany. So you're going to have a British zone, you're going to have a French zone, an American zone, which essentially is West Berlin, and you're essentially going to have a Soviet zone that eventually makes up East Berlin. The problem with this, guys, if you think about it, is that Berlin, as we said a moment ago, is completely surrounded by, you guessed it, Soviet territory. This is going to create some complications. Why? Because of the ideological differences. So the communism that the Soviet Union wants to see expanding, and of course the democracy principles that the United States and other world countries like Great Britain wants. Okay. So the question is, guys, all right, we know that Germany is going to become a pretty important area. What about this other concept of collective security? Well, guys, this is where the United Nations kind of moves us further into this direction. We'll look at NATO here in a second. But guys, I want you to think about World War II. All right. So you can pause the screen and actually write the details down if you want. But the big picture here is, guys, if you look at the key issues, now the UN is going to, again, replace the League of Nations. All right. So the US is going to become a very active member. Okay. And so I want you to think, guys, if you were living during World War II, you were experiencing, or at least kind of studying and actually hearing about some of the things, what would the war, how would it influence the vision of the United Nations? Well, it's very similar to the League, right? We don't want another major war. We don't want another major catastrophe. Guys, remember, over 50 million casualties in World War II. It's a lot of people. But you also have to throw in there, guys, the idea that we have weapons of mass destruction now, or at least, the idea of the atomic bomb, okay? Potentially there, with America using it during, of course, the war against Japan. And then you also have the idea of human rights that came out of the Holocaust with eventually the Nuremberg trials and different things like that. All right, amongst others that happened in Japan. But I would say the ones that you probably hear the most about are the Nuremberg trials with Nazis and war crimes against humanity, as it became noted as. All right. So the UN eventually, guys, down the line will be creating what's called a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Okay. And if you want to look that up and read it, it's very, guys, you're not going to be surprised by the kind of things that they identify as rights that all people should have, rights to practice their own religion, and, obviously to have other opportunities to be protected. All right. But guys, I want you to look here. It says permanent members. All right. So I want you to think of the 5 countries. If you're going to identify 5 countries that were on the Allied power side, that are going to have a considerable amount of influence post-World War II, what would they be? And there's going to be 5 of them that stand out. You're going to have the United States. You're going to have Great Britain. You're going to have France. You're going to have the Soviet Union. And you're also going to have China. Now, something to keep in mind, guys, as we'll see in our next lesson, China is not divided yet. Okay. So therefore, you're not going to have a communist China yet, and you're not going to have a nationalist China. That does happen within about 4 or 5 years of World War II. And it does have a very big effect on world politics. All right. But what they did, guys, is the UN was organized. They have, kind of like a General Assembly. Every country has an ambassador that goes there, represents their sets of interest. They vote on things. But guys, if you take a look here, you'll notice they also have a Security Council. All right. This is kind of like a group that there's only 15 countries that make it up out of all the members. But here's the catch. The permanent members of the UN all have seats on the Security Council, and they all have veto power. Now, this is interesting, guys, because what this group essentially does, if the UN is going to make a decision to use military action to kind of settle a dispute or something, the Security Council must, in fact, vote on it. Okay. And I want you to think, why is that a big deal? Well, all of these 5 countries have veto power. All right. So according to the UN Charter, they only require 9 countries out of the 15 to actually to kind of decide to go to war. But here's the catch. If any one of those 5 Security Council members that are permanent members decide to veto going to war or conflict, then the UN cannot do it. Now, I want you to think about this, guys. Why does that create a considerable set of issues? And you guessed it, because you're going to have different sets of interests. The Soviets are not going to want to support as much things that deal with democratic nations and vice versa. Why is that a big deal? Because eventually down the line, about 4 years after the war, we're going to have further developing organizations for collective security. So a lot of these democratic nations do not have a lot of love lost between them and the Soviet Union. They eventually create their own organization that we call NATO. Okay. Now, guys, if you look here, you'll notice NATO on the map here. This is actually going to be the countries at the time that made up NATO. There have been some additional ones that have joined over time. Okay. But guys, for the most part, you'll notice the ones that probably stand out the most. You're going to have the United States, Canada, Great Britain, France, and basically a lot of Western Europe. And so it's basically a group that's designed to protect the interest of those countries that have similar political ideals, similar economic ideals, etc. All right. Now, as you can imagine, guys, the Soviet Union, right? Yes, they support communism, but they also feel that their livelihood is at threat as well. So what do? They basically form their own version of collective security. We call this the Warsaw Pact. Right. So guys, pretty much down here, if you take a look, you'll notice all these countries that you see in the different colors here. All right. Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, etc., Ukraine, etc. Guys, basically the countries that make up the Soviet Union and a lot of the countries that make up what's called the Soviet bloc, all right, or Eastern Bloc, they're all going to be a part of the Warsaw Pact. So it's a very similar kind of thing, an alliance system that comes together. Now, I want you guys to look at this slide as we kind of transition to American containment and America's role in the world. All right. And I like this quote. I actually found it in a course I took a few years ago. And guys, I want you to think, okay, what does this author, and it's an anonymous quote here, guys, for a reason. All right. But I want you to think, okay, what does this illustrate about how the United States is going to be different post-World War II? So look at what he or she says. The leader says, never again will America be an island to itself. No private program and no public policy in any sector of our national life can now escape from the compelling fact that if it is not framed with reference to the what? World, it is framed with perfect futility. All right. So guys, my question to all of you would be to kind of maybe brainstorm this a little bit and ask yourself, okay, what does this say about America's role changing? Well, I think it says a lot of things in a very short amount of space. First of all, no more isolationism. All right. Isolationism is not going to be a feasible thing with America's role that we'll talk more about in a second. The other thing, guys, if you think about it, is that no private program or no public policy in our national life can now escape the fact that it is framed reference to the world. What does that mean, guys? It means that a lot of the things that we as Americans hold true are very much connected to global ideas, supporting the globe, right? Now, this could be anything from containment of communism to, supporting, of course, American ideals politically to even economic things, all right? So, guys, this is a big deal. I mean, a lot of you are like, okay, it's a short quote. But, guys, if you think about it, what this author, I think, is getting at is that America is going to have a much wider range of influence. We were already a world power, keep in mind, before World War II started. Okay. We are definitely a superpower at the end of World War II and also, of course, during this time period up until even the present. Okay. And so containment policy. So where does it basically come from? First of all, a gentleman who was given a lot of the credit for some of the ideas is going to be a gentleman by the name of George Kennan. Kennan's picture is right here. Okay. The basic nuts and bolts, as you saw, guys, in my definition, is it is a movement to bottle up or stop the spread of communism. Guys, recite that to your dog, recite that to your cat, recite that to your computer, whatever, thing that you need to do. It is important. So that is going to be the driving force of a lot of American policy during this time period. Okay. And remember, it's about 45 to 46 years. So that's a very extensive time that we're going to be involved. Okay. And so how do we know that our world is divided? Well, first of all, it's not a big surprise that somebody like Winston Churchill, that's his picture right there, guys, comes over to the United States and makes his famous Iron Curtain speech. The question I would have for you guys is first of all, do you know anything about it? What does he mean? It's a metaphor in a sense. Eventually, the Berlin Wall becomes pretty much associated with it down the line. But guys, if you think about it, this is the dividing line between, as Churchill would say, the free world or the democratic world, right, which you can see here is in blue, okay, and the world that, of course, is more communist or basically the other side, which is going to be under the influence of communism in the Soviet Union. All right. So he makes this very clear. It's almost like, some people would say it's almost like he's saying that you have to choose, right? You're choosing. All right. I don't know if it's a good idea or not, but nonetheless, he kind of puts the world on notice that this is important to keep in mind. Okay. This is a little chart, guys, as we kind of explore a lot of the things over the next few sessions and for part of the year. Okay. What we want to understand, guys, is how does American policy between this time period really influence different parts of the world? Now, I will be honest and tell you that we are not going to talk extensively about Vietnam. Why? Because we're going to spend a whole part of our year later on Vietnam. All right. But guys, if you want to keep this in mind, you're looking at how does the Cold War affect parts of Europe? How does it affect parts of East and Southeast Asia? How does it affect parts of the Middle East and Northern Africa? Okay. And also, how does it affect Latin America? And also general things. All right. So, for example, the launching of Sputnik in 1957 by the Soviet Union is going to prompt, and by the way, if you didn't know this, Dwight D. Eisenhower was in office then, guys. It's going to prompt a huge response by the United States. Okay. So we'll look at that a little bit later if time allows. Okay. And so what does Kennan say, guys, as far as really the probably the most famous quote that he makes or part of the document is the long telegram. But guys, look what he says. He says in very, very straight language here, conflicts between capitalist states, so in other words, U.S., Britain, etc., though likewise fraught with danger for the Soviet Union, USSR, nevertheless hold out great possibilities for advancement of socialist cause, particularly if USSR remains military powerful, ideologically monolithic, and faithful to its present brilliant leadership. Okay, now you got to remember, Stalin is still in power in 1946. Harry Truman has been president for less than a year, right? So this is a very big thing that Truman, guys, eventually, as we'll see here in a moment, is going to really take on with a lot of his responsibility as president. Okay. All right. So where do we see containment policy in action? What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, actually putting your money where your mouth is. All right, guys, in some cases, literally. Right. So if you think about it, guys, what would the state of Europe have been after World War II? And a lot of you are like, well, Mr. Baker, we know that Great Britain had a lot of destruction. France had a lot of destruction. Other countries that obviously were involved in the war are going to be destroyed as well, parts of them anyway. All right. And guys, that's altogether true. And so the United States, compared to those countries, I'm not downplaying the 400,000 or 500,000 deaths in America had, et cetera, guys. It's very important to keep in mind. But guys, if you look at the effects on the home front, it's going to be very limited compared to the destruction that we saw in parts of Europe, right? Because remember, most of the war is being fought, the European campaign that is, on their soil, right? Not on American soil, right? Pearl Harbor was attacked, but for the most part, a lot of the other things were pretty much abroad, right? Now, why do I bring that up? Well, here's the reason why. The United States under Truman is going to see it as their duty, their rights, even their responsibility, you could say, to actually go out and actually do some things that involves trying to help rebuild. That's going to be the purpose of what we call the Marshall Plan. All right. George Marshall, guys, I would argue, and I think a lot of historians would probably agree with this, that he is one of those people that you hear about, but you probably don't know as much about him as you do figures like Eisenhower or Douglas MacArthur. But guys, make no mistake about it. His Marshall Plan is absolutely vital to understand. I mean, you're talking about investing millions and millions of dollars into these countries. Now, guys, this little map right there shows us the amount of aid that is going to each one of these nations. Now, take a look at what you notice. What countries are taking the aid and what countries are not? And the answer is, guys, you'll notice that a large part of Western Europe and even West Germany. Now, here's the thing that's interesting. So a lot of us are like, well, why doesn't the Soviet Union take it? Guys, we actually offered it to them. Stalin, as brutal as the guy was with all his purges and the 20 million deaths and things like that, right? The guy might be a little bit brutal, actually quite a bit brutal, but he also understands what's expected. If you take this aid, guys, the underlying expectation or handwriting on the wall is that you are supporting what America stands for. Now, let's face the facts. Is a stronger Europe economically and politically in America's best interest? I would say yes. Ergo, there's definitely a reason why to do that. Okay. And so this Marshall Plan is going to be really important to kind of sustain this stability from an American perspective. All right. Now, the Truman Doctrine, guys, if you take a look there, this is going to be really, I would say, guys, the first, or one of the first, I should say, truly containment-based policies that comes out of the Truman administration. So what is a doctrine? It's formally a statement. It's a position that you take. There's two countries, guys, that at this period of time, around 1947, were on the verge of falling to communism. One was Greece, which is right here. The other one is Turkey. An easy way to remember that, I think, is that you got to have grease to fry turkey. All right? So Truman, guys, makes a famous message to Congress that eventually defines the Truman Doctrine. He basically tells Congress that we need to be willing to actually invest money into especially protecting both these areas. Now, why? Well, guys, think about it like this. Greece is the cradle of democracy. It's symbolic. All right? And so a lot of you guys are like, well, okay, Mr. Baker, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. How do you convince the American people that thousands of miles away, all right, that communism is obviously something that they need to be concerned about? Well, for a lot of that, guys, as we'll see in one of our future lessons, it's going to be really building up the possibility of this Cold War at home. We actually refer to that as the Second Red Scare. Okay. So you're going to see a lot of, again, a lot of you are like, well, Mr. Baker, first Red Scare happened during and also post-World War I. Is it going to be very similar? In some ways it is. There are some differences. I would say, to an extent, there's going to be more spy cases, more, like you hear a lot about the Rosenberg trials and also the Alger Hiss case that came out of that. All right. But guys, at the end of the day, what's the point here? And this is interesting. All right. I once heard it put like this: taking upon the responsibility of containment with the Truman Doctrine is very much like America receiving a torch passing with its international and global responsibility. Right? Because who had done this for years and years and years? And the British and the French, right, had been very, very, hands-on with this. At least a lot of times they had been. And guys, Truman understands that. And what does he do? He says to these two countries and others, he says, okay, what are you going to do to actually help these countries out? Now, was that him not wanting to overstep his boundaries? I'm not really sure. What I do know, guys, is that if you think about it, why are Britain and France going to be the highest on the list of getting this aid from the Marshall Plan? And guys, it's not a big secret. A lot of it goes back to the effects of World War II. They are not in a financial and economic position to do what they've historically done for decades and decades and decades, and even centuries. All right. So therefore, it's like, okay, if we don't take upon this responsibility as a world country, then are we selling ourselves short? Are we not holding true to democratic and American political principles? All right. So guys, very, very important. You'll notice here, as we'll see in our next lesson, guys, Eisenhower is going to actually do something very similar to Truman. It's a doctrine. It proves, or it gives a position. All right. I want you to look at the political cartoon, and we'll end with this, guys, before we move into our next lesson. What is the whole point of this political cartoon? It's got a lot of elements to it. So you've got the Marshall Plan, Europe. You've got the American taxpayer, self-support. What is it really getting at? Is it support for containment? I would say to a large extent, guys, the American taxpayer. Is it important for he or she or they to know that, what, we're going to have to, or at least be supportive of a lot of this aid that's going abroad, this foreign aid, to kind of uphold these principles that are defining American policy during the Cold War. And remember, guys, this is only a few years after World War II. This is not the 50s yet. It's not the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, or early 90s. It is actually very shortly after the war. All right. So next time we'll pick up by looking more at the regions of American involvement during this 1945 to 1963 time period. We'll focus on Europe, East Asia, Middle East, and also Latin America, to name a few. As always, guys, it's been a pleasure being with you. Hope you've had a good lesson. I know I did. At the end of the day, feel free to email me with any questions that you have, and I hope you stay safe and take care. Until next time. Bye-bye.